Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Bignotti. I have a bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of Connecticut in Natural Resource Management, and I'm a senior project manager with 21 years of experience, currently with the consulting firm Weston & Sampson. And so, as Ron mentioned, we were retained by Groton Utilities, providing an overview of potential permitting requirements related to allowing public access for hiking and utility-owned lands from outreach to other utilities in order to understand for those utilities that have reservoirs in Connecticut, how they allow or don't allow public access on their lands, and to provide a limited and neutral review of the current proposal by Tri-Town Trails in order to make use of utility-owned land for hiking. Next slide, please. So my presentation begins with discussion surrounding the Connecticut Department of Health requirements regarding recreational activities on utility-owned land, followed by a discussion of our utility survey, and then finally some information on the current proposal. Slide, please. First, to discuss what Groton Utilities have to do from a permitting standpoint, there are a variety of statutes and regulations regarding appropriate activities on utility-owned land. They're all laid out in the report in more detail than what I'm going to get into today. Basically, state law allows for passive public recreation to occur, such as hiking, fishing, snowshoeing, things of that nature. More intensive activities that change the nature of the land, such as building a golf course, are not allowed. Ultimately, the water utility is responsible for assuring drinking water quality, whether recreation is allowed or not. And there are various statutes that allow for enforcement of state law on utility-owned lands, either through local police or even through the utility itself having sworn officers. The DPH manages public recreation activities through a permit program, where the water company must be the applicant. Next slide, please. So there are 3 permits that would be needed in one application package to DPH. In order to apply for the permit, the specific area where public access for recreation is proposed would need to be discussed, along with any improvements that are being designed or constructed to support the activity. So DPH has a standard general application that it uses as a cover for all of its permits, which would need to be submitted, along with a change in use of water company lands permit and a recreational lands permit. These permits are reviewed simultaneously. The change in use permit is basically needed because right now DPH has a certain understanding of how Groton Utilities uses its utility-owned land. For example, providing guided tours, allowing certain research activities and things of that nature. If you change that, then they need to approve that through a prescribed process based on the statutes. The recreational lands permit is designed to establish conditions for the recreational program. It requires annual reporting, and it is only good for a 5-year time frame. As part of that permit, DPH will allow a utility to operate its own local permitting program to allow or disallow certain activities on the land. The conditions will vary based on the specific activity and the area that's being used. And DPH doesn't really have any set guidelines for how they set those conditions. It's very site-specific and activity-specific. So in doing our regulation review, we also came across the question of liability, because many utilities, including Groton, are always concerned about potential liability. So I'm not a lawyer. I would recommend that the utility consult with its counsel on any questions of liability, but based on the information I reviewed, there were changes in the legislation regarding municipal liability for recreational use of all lands, not just utility-owned lands. And that 2000 legislation is very protective of municipalities opening their lands for public recreational purposes. And this change occurred because MDC was sued due to a cyclist getting injured on their land. And more description is in the report about this, but essentially when the judgment was upheld against MDC, they said that they needed to take a hard look at whether or not they wanted to continue allowing recreation. And the legislature that the state got involved and said, well, MDC's recreation program is very important to recreation in Central Connecticut. We're going to change the law and make sure that frivolous lawsuits cannot go forward against municipalities. So now there's a high bar. There has to be a willful or malicious failure to warn the public on the account of a dangerous condition or structure or activity that's known to the owner. And if the public is using the land irresponsibly, which was established in the court case against MDC, but because the laws in place at the time, the judgment was still found in favor of the plaintiff. Now, municipalities are not responsible for injuries that are occurred due to prohibited use or irresponsible use of the land. And that's a big change from what the law was before. And it's generally considered to be very protective of the municipality. So any questions on that before we jump into the water utility?
So are you aware of any liability protection for the water companies if someone enters onto our property and somehow puts some substance into the water that then affects either personnel or property because of what they've done? In other words, it's not necessarily someone tripping and falling on our property, but someone comes in and intentionally does something to the water source, or maybe even unintentionally does something to the water source that then affects people or property downstream.
The general position for EPA and Groton and all utilities in Connecticut just went through a risk and resilience assessment and updating their emergency response plan, which looked at such actions as you're discussing, which are terrorist actions. And generally speaking,
Well, it may not necessarily be a terrorist action. It could be an unintentional consequence.
It's true. But in general, if that's a prohibited use of the land, or it's something that's being done maliciously, or even accidentally if somebody drives a car in, utilities are not generally responsible for that. Examples would be Wyndham when planes have crashed into the reservoir because they're right next to the airport, which is not too dissimilar from Groton. But the utility is not being held responsible for that plane crash. The pilot is if they're found at fault.
You're not getting my question. My question is, are we shielded from liability if someone sues us because they've been harmed because someone either intentionally or unintentionally put something in the water that then causes harm to those individuals? Are we shielded from liability? And maybe that's a question for our attorney, not you. I don't know.
I think that would probably be best left for them.
Okay.
My understanding is that I have not heard of anyone being held responsible for that, but that doesn't necessarily cover all the bases, and it was not the focus of our investigation.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Continuing on, so we reached out to the other 25 water utilities in the state that were known to have active or inactive reservoirs. And our goal in reaching out to these utilities was to understand and gain information about the types of public access they allowed, the costs that they absorbed each year related to such access, and any potential concerns they had regarding managing their programs, if they had programs. And if they didn't have programs, what concerns they had that would lead them not want to have those programs. So the goal being to help Groton utilities understand what is typical for Connecticut utilities to have utility-owned land. So we received a 60% reply rate to our survey, which was pretty good, but we decided that it would be best to do additional research from what we could find online about those utilities and those towns with their ordinances and things like that in order to fill in data gaps and try to provide a more complete picture for the utility. So back in 2008, 2009, when the Bluff Point Preston Preston Trail Committee was working on their 2009 master plan for the Tri-Town Trail Network, they retained a consultant that was paid for administratively through SECOG, and they also did a survey of utilities. And so we were able to use that data as kind of a historical benchmark to see how things have changed over time. So back at that time, in general, 46% of the surveyed utilities reported allowing public access to the land in some manner, while 54% reported that they did not allow public access in any way. And there was a breakdown between those allowed near active reservoirs and inactive reservoirs.
What was that year again?
That was around 2009. Next slide, please. Sit there.
There's some water for you, okay?
Oh, thank you. So these percentages appear to have changed slightly over time. Today, the percentages are more evenly split, with 43% utilities reporting that they allow public access for hiking activities in some manner, and 42% reporting that they did not. And then there are the 11% of the utilities in the middle, such as ground utilities, that provide access but only in a guided and controlled manner, such as through guided hikes, specialized discussions and setup for research and things of that nature to occur on the land. So next slide, please. So looking at these utilities based on their relative size in terms of population served and public access levels, overall the utilities that are larger than ground utilities, and this is especially true for the largest utilities in Connecticut, they tend to allow hiking in some form in specific areas. They have specified trails, they have permit programs that say where you can go, where you can't go, or they have informal programs where the watershed is generally open and they encourage people to stay on the trails through rules and regulations. However, many of the utilities that are just slightly larger than ground utilities tend to not allow public access for hiking. And utilities that are smaller than ground utilities in general tend not to allow hiking unless it's the exception being the town of Portland, who allow hiking next to their inactive reservoir. Or they allow guided tours in a similar manner in ground utilities. So we also asked utilities if they recalled how their program got started, what was the driving factor. And for many utilities, many of the public access programs have been in place for a very long time, and they just don't really have access to the information anymore. But for those that were more recent, the town of Manchester reported that the public was using the lands without permission, and enforcement couldn't keep up. And so they opened up those lands specifically and only to town residents. Norwich Public Utilities reported that they have a lot of inactive reservoirs and they just ceased enforcement of their rules at the inactive reservoirs by public request. Regional Water Authority stated as part of their founding legislation, and other utilities reported that they started their programs due to public demand. Next slide, please. The DPH assigns classifications for utility-owned watershed land based on the position of it in the watershed. The lands closest to the reservoir are classified as Class 1, and DPH recognizes this as needing the highest level of source protection. And then there are Class 2 lands, which are set back a little farther from those lands, but they also drain into the reservoir, so they're important to protect. And then Class 3 are lands such as where the treatment plant for ground utilities sits, where it doesn't actually drain into the reservoir, it drains to the south. So the majority of respondents indicated that Class 2 lands were in use for public hiking access, but most utilities reported that both Class 1 and Class 2 lands were in use, which makes sense when you think about it, because if you have a trail network that's going across the land, at some point you're going to have a stream crossing. And those stream crossings are always going to be Class 1 land because the streams are tributary to the reservoir. We also asked about what concerns were, both for utilities that had public access programs and those that didn't. And most utilities were concerned about the potential risk of vandalism and sabotage to infrastructure and water supply sources. Around half had general safety and security concerns, as well as concern about water quality impacts that were specifically arising from erosion or sedimentation as a result of public use. Relatively few respondents were concerned about ongoing costs or having unsafe access into their public lands. Next slide, please. Okay. Activities that were performed by the utilities in order to support the recreational program were varied, and it depended on the utility and how extensive the program was. But most noted the need for increased security patrols and rules enforcement along their trails, as well as the need for regular litter collection and trail maintenance activities. Some offered portable toilets and trash cans, as well as identifying the need for additional water quality sampling in order to track potential erosion concerns. Several utilities reported having partnerships with outside agencies, such as the Connecticut Forest and Park Association, who maintained the trails for them. And it was more of a, they were there to assist that organization if they needed specific help, but for the most part, they didn't do any trail maintenance themselves. Next slide, please. In terms of financial considerations, in general, utilities tend to be responsible for covering annual or routine maintenance costs, but not the initial capital improvements. Some utilities did report doing some capital improvements, but overall, they're usually covered by an outside organization. Most common maintenance expenditure was related to roads and trails and entrances and exits from the land, particularly for things like gates, fencing, and rules signage. Specific expenditures, again, vary by the utility based on their specific situation. In terms of typical annual budget estimates, utilities generally struggle to provide numbers in response to our survey. Many indicated that the ongoing cost was so ingrained in the source protection program that it was difficult to estimate the hours per week or the salary expenditure. Based on the responses received, a range of 10 to 20,000 per year may be typical for most Connecticut utilities. And regional water's expenditures are higher, roughly $2,000 per mile per year, because they have 50 miles of trails that they try to manage, and they tend to do it themselves. And none of the utilities were able to provide how much money they spent on initial startup capital costs for putting the program together. So it's clear that the first year expense for setting up a program would likely be significantly higher than these estimates if things like new salary costs were going to come into play for the utility. We also asked utilities if they would provide a piece of advice for something that the utility should really think about here in consideration of a public access program. And there's a variety of responses, things like strong enforcement of rules and regulations, don't allow bikes, make sure dogs are leashed at all times, limit to use, confine it to very specific areas, have security patrols and cameras, and make sure that you have safety precautions in place, especially if you're allowing this near an active reservoir. Have sufficient police available to enforce the rules, because people will return and break the rules again if they're only given a warning and asked to leave. Be prepared to fully fund and manage the program and retain the right to discontinue the program if it adversely affects the supplier and the environment. In other words, give yourself an out. Strongly consider the benefits and costs of changing your current situation. If your current situation is working, there has to be a very good reason why their advice to change what you're doing right now. And lastly, no swimming signs are not enough to keep people out of the water. Be prepared to spend a lot of money on signage and public education. Next slide, please. So in summary, utilities that are similar or smaller sizes of Groton utilities tend to not allow recreation near their active reservoirs, or they allow it in a similar manner to Groton, namely guided tours, guided access to the land, etc. Utilities that are slightly larger than Groton tend to not allow recreation at all. But overall, the utilities that are larger than Groton, as you start getting into some of the bigger and bigger utilities in Connecticut, they generally have recreation programs, with some being very formal programs where it's only allowed by a permit with the utility. Finally, out of the 5 utilities that have a reservoir system that's structured similar to Groton utilities, namely a series of reservoirs that drain into one distribution reservoir that leads into one treatment plant, only Waterbury Water Department, which is the largest utility, allows unguided hiking through their watershed lands. And they believe the trails in their land were developed originally due to inaccuracies in property survey, because their land is very, very hilly. And they've looked at the trails and they've discovered that there's no feasible alternative to move them, and so they have left them in place. Any questions on the survey?
You mentioned the permit, and I read in here that some have a permit. I understand in certain federal lands, if you want to hike, you have to have a permit to go to hike on that property. Can you talk about how are you familiar with how they did their permitting and how it worked and how successful it was?
So this is specific to the DPH permit that the utility must get, or the permit that the utility hands out to?
Yes.
Okay. So Regional has a permit program, and based on their descriptions, they have special permits for certain activities such as horseback riding and hunting. And then they have a general permit that people can pay into, and it gives them access to all of their public recreation programs. And so that is hiking, snowshoeing, access to all the 50 miles of trails, access to fishing at Lake Saltonstall. And so that's an annual fee that they pay into. And then whenever they're on the land, they're supposed to have that permit. Connecticut Water Company also has a permit program for their fishing program in Sheriffson, but they don't have a permit program for hiking. And beyond that, I'm not aware of any other specific permit programs that are currently in place.
And so from my understanding, then the utility would issue the permit upon an application?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, being no further questions.
I do have a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
Could you define class 1 land, class 2 reservoir land? It's only class 2 reservoir land if the water company owns it.
It is only a class of land, 1, 2, or 3, if the water utility owns it. Yes.
So class 2 land can be privately owned and developed.
No, class, if it's privately owned, it would not be class 2 land.
Right.
The classifications are only for utility owned land.
Right.
So if someone like Avalonia or a private citizen owns land that's in the watershed, it does not have a classification.
Correct. But if somebody wanted to build a house on it or develop, they could.
If someone wanted to build a house, it would be subject to the normal local zoning laws.
Right.
With any other overlay zones that utility may have been able to put in place.
In your report, I'm reading it quite a few times, it is referred to distribution reservoir and a supply reservoir. Could you define those?
So the distribution reservoir, from DPH's perspective, is the Groton reservoir aquatic, because that has the intake that goes into the treatment. All the other reservoirs feed that reservoir, so they are supply reservoirs. And that's the only difference. If you have a pipe into a treatment plant, it becomes a distribution reservoir.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, the last section of my presentation is regarding the current proposal for Tri-Town Trails. This is considered to be a test case for establishing a recreational trail on Groton Utilities owned land. A recreational trail that's specifically under proposal right now would be developed between the Route 117 park and ride, coming through Gate 23 off of Route 117 near the Stone House, and then proceed generally northwest into an existing trail network that leads to the COP property. Staff have noted that the trail network, not the gravel access road, but the trail network for hiking trails on Groton utility owned land were developed unsanctioned by Groton Utilities. The goal would be for Tri-Town Trails that this section of trail would eventually become part of the overall larger Bluff Point to Preston trail network that they are working on developing. So the current proposal originated in early 2021, and routing for the site has been walked by Tri-Town Trails with utility staff, and also with Weston and Sampson and Tri-Town Trails earlier this year. The routing through the utility owned land primarily uses the existing gravel access roads and existing blades trails. Again, those trails being unsanctioned by Groton Utilities. Based on my walkthrough, I found that the hiking through the proposed routing was feasible. The elevation gain is relatively minor elevation changes, but they were not too difficult to traverse. So we're going to hold on to the feasible statement and come back to that on my last slide. So this is just a map showing the potential routing. Again, down in the lower right-hand corner is that 117 park and ride. That black line shows some improvements, crosswalk, maybe a sidewalk coming up Route 117 to Gate 23. The gray line shows the gravel access road that comes into the site and works its way around the north side of Magnut Reservoir. Then there's an opportunity to develop a new walking path moving north along an existing stone wall that's on the property that then connects into that blaze network that's on the north part of the site. And from there are a variety of trails that lead west into the COP property. Variety of options that could potentially be used, but Tri-Town Trails has made clear that alternatives are possible and that the trail, as shown here, could be moved to avoid sensitive areas, and are willing to work with Groton Utilities to do that. So some pictures of the area. Here's the gravel access road next to the reservoir that leads back towards the stone house. Turning around, and you see the causeway that goes over. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was Hatfield Brook that comes in from the northeast. Okay, and then as you move up towards the north end of the reservoir into the woods, the gravel access road again comes around the northern bend. Up in the woods, we have these footpaths that are defined and they have blazes on the trees that someone has put there. And another picture showing where there's kind of a more open area with in the understory where that new path along that stone wall could go. So the general conclusions from the sidewalk are that trail development appears possible through this stretch of property without significant clearing being needed, but there would be trail improvements that are needed along the trail, some clearing at the causeway, variety of improvements related probably to safety, such as putting up railings and things like that. Stone house is there and potentially would need either to be refurbished or protected in some way because it's unclear right now if the structure is safe. Right now it's behind a fence, so it's cut off from the public, but it goes open to the public. There probably would need to be some discussion on how to improve that structure. And then lastly, at gate 23, in terms of allowing access into the property, either manually controlled or automated in some way so that the gates would close each night. There would also be a need for additional capital improvements, which would be identified by Groton Utilities. Some work has been done with that, which is included in the report between staff and KFA Consulting. Next slide, please. Staff have numerous concerns regarding the proposal, both on the Pahigna site and also the overall 6 miles that were originally proposed in the 2009 master plan. The concerns are presented in a lot of detail in the report, but basically going through the primary concerns, and this is by no means to be an exhaustive list. Number one is that recreation is not their primary charge. The primary charge is protection of the water supply. The fact that they have a single distribution reservoir and a single intake, they believe that increases the risk if anything does happen of the distribution system being affected. They're concerned about potential increased erosion and sedimentation, potential increases in vandalism, potential for misuse of the trail network. For example, having dogs or people go into the water if that trail is that close to the Pahigna Reservoir, or people using their bikes on the trail and then getting into the woods and finding out that the trail is not really suitable for biking, even though there's signs posted saying no biking. Staff are concerned about their limited enforcement authority. It's difficult to actually cite people because if you find them, you ask them to leave, they may leave, and they may leave more quickly before the police get there, and then they'll be back, similar to what other utilities were saying. There's also a variety of historic sites and natural communities that have been identified and are being mapped on utility-owned land, and they'd like for those sites to continue to be protected. They're concerned about additional administrative and management costs, recurring costs associated with running a program. And lastly, staff believe that there are feasible alternatives in the watershed. There are greenways that are on either side of Groton Utilities on land, and they would prefer that the commission and the utility continue to fundraise and contribute support financially to the purchase of additional watershed land. Because ultimately, if utility does that and helps someone like Avalonia, for example, continue to buy land and protect it through a land trust, they can open it for recreation, and it doesn't affect classifications through DPH. It doesn't require permitting, a special permit through DPH to allow the activity on utility-owned land. And it also prevents that property from being developed. So they see that as a more feasible alternative to increase the protection of the amount of land in the watershed that's protected, as opposed to opening up utilities class 1 land, utilities class 2 land, which, because it's closer to the reservoir, DPH believes should be protected more strongly. Next slide, please. Tri-Town Trails acknowledges that recreation is not the utility's primary charge. And that's one reason why it seeks to establish a partnership with Groton Utilities to support recreational access, similar to what other utilities have done with the Connecticut Forest Park Association. They state that they're prepared to work with Groton Utilities on any and all concerns, but that they can't really go out and try to fundraise or try to convince the towns of Ledyard and Groton to stick to the agreements that they had made in the 2009 master plan, where they would provide some level of funding each year, without some sort of agreement in place with the utility that says, if you were able to do these things and build these things and complete these capital improvements and maintain this level of let's say sanitary controls related to erosion and sedimentation, then if you're able to do those things, then we'll allow the access to occur. They need to reach that level of preliminary agreement. They don't believe that they have reached that point yet in their conversations over the years with Groton utilities. They also note that the risks of the watershed exist today, and that having open access to the land doesn't necessarily change the desire of a bad actor to come in and cause some damage to the watershed or cause some damage to the reservoir directly. They note that alternative routings can be developed for sensitive areas. They would like to assist with signage to note where there are historic sites or historic artifacts that should be protected. They would fundraise for things like fencing to go around those areas so people would stay out. And they would be pleased to work with the commission on fundraising and offsetting capital costs up front, as well as recurring and operational costs. And lastly, they note that there are some unsafe trails that may be on watershed land that were developed, again, unsanctioned by others. And they would provide advice, guidance, and support relating to closing those areas in order to focus the recreational activities in areas that are appropriate. So, I mentioned before how I believe that it was feasible to hike through this stretch of property. The principal question for the commission is to decide on whether allowing hiking through this stretch of utility-owned land or any stretch of utility-owned land is prudent and should be pursued, or is not prudent, such that other alternatives should be pursued. In other words, do the potential benefits to the public by allowing public access for hiking outweigh the potential risks to water supply and any potential costs to the utility? This is my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any additional questions.